There are an estimated 1 million veterans who identify as LGBTQ+. Like their civilian counterparts, LGBTQ+ veterans often face a unique set of challenges before, during, and after their service, based simply on their identity. Veterans who identify as LGBTQ+ may have faced discrimination. For example, some people have had interactions that make them feel unsafe disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity. Some veterans have faced pressures to hide their identity, particularly during their military service. Others have wrestled with stress in deciding whether and when to come out to family members, friends, or fellow veterans. This episode features the stories of 4 veterans who committed to embracing their identity and living openly as their truest selves.
My name's Tim. I was in the Marine Corps. I went to Parris Island 2008, and I served on Camp Pendleton at SOI West and 1-1 as an armor 2111.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I served in the United States Army from 1979 through 1990. I was stationed in Fort Hood, Texas, Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Richardson, Fort Wainwright, Alaska.
I'm Becca, and I served in the Navy from 2004 to 2009 as an aviation electrician. Forward deployed, Germany, Afghanistan, and I was stationed in Washington State as well as California.
My name is Ryan. I served 3 years in the United States Army, regular Army, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for 3 years from 1997 to 2000.
Ryan originally enlisted because he saw it as an opportunity to continue doing something he loved, performing. He hoped to perform in the Army Soldier Show. Instead, he ended up working as a fire direction specialist for the multiple launch rocket system.
I had actually joined to sing. I was big into performing theater when I was growing up in school and found out about the Soldier Show through a buddy of mine in high school. And so called up the recruiter and actually volunteered myself for service on the condition that I would hopefully, be able to get into the Soldier Show. And I found my way into the artillery.
Ryan recalls enjoying his time in the Army, though he regrets that he wasn't able to be open and honest with his fellow soldiers due to don't ask, don't tell.
I had a great experience. I think it was known, that I may have been, a gay male in the military, but, again, it's just something you didn't discuss. But I had a successful, career in the military. Was promoted several times and, had a good time, had a lot of fun. And I had a good group of, friends. I had a good social network within the military. So it was different though. It was still a little hard not being able to be open and honest with the people that I was working with.
Erin believed that she had found her calling. She served as an infantry platoon leader and infantry commander in the Army, and she felt this perfectly suited her personality. However, her career was suddenly cut short.
My career ended abruptly when the military learned that I was a transgender person. It had not been affecting my performance of duties, but in 1990 it was considered incompatible with serving in the military. And so when they discovered that I was trans, I was relieved of command, and within 3 weeks I was out of the service. It was devastating. I was an infantry officer. I mean, that's my identity at that point in my life. And I had a wife and 3 little children, and the loss of my career affected me both in my personal identity, but also in my ability to take care of my family. It affected my family in that my wife had been really involved as well, and she had her identity was being part of the military as well. So after we had to leave the military, our relationship deteriorated quickly and fell apart.
While deployed in Afghanistan, Becca had a traumatic experience. Despite the fact that she was trained to help others respond to incidents of military sexual trauma, she still struggled with how to respond.
So I was a SAVI rep, sexual assault victim intervention, and I was that designated rep in Afghanistan, which basically meant if there were any, incidences, I would be the person like kind of hand-holding somebody throughout the process. I had somebody break into my room or my B hut and try to attack me. Kind of for me, because I was a SAVI rep, I knew how important it was to mention it. Still, I was like, okay, I have to come forward, I have to say it, and so I did. And actually, my command's response was to want to kick me out of Afghanistan. And so I remember my, some people flew from my base up to Afghanistan and tried to kind of walk and talk to me and say, hey, don't you want to leave? And I said, no, if you kick me out, then what kind of message is that sending to other people?
An offhand comment from a friend about his sexuality helped push Tim to enlist in the Marines. Once he was in, he felt a lot of tension having to hide his identity while also trying to prove himself to his fellow Marines.
He was giving me all kinds of hell. And he meant it as a joke, but he said you would never survive one day in the Marine Corps, much less make it through boot camp. And within 1 month, I had a ship out date to join the Marine Corps. I put my personal needs and desires to the side to be the best Marine that I could be. But for me, I was so scared of anybody ever thinking that I even might have a thought going in that direction. I would take a bus down to San Diego and just drink myself stupid. And half the time, I don't even know what happened on those weekends. And I don't know, what kind of situations I put myself in. But the thought was tearing me in half that I was being someone to these brothers of mine, but inside I was someone else.
Often due to discrimination and stigma, LGBTQ+ veterans are at an elevated risk for chronic stress, which can, in turn, increase the risk for certain mental and physical health conditions, including substance use disorders, PTSD, and anxiety. Also, LGBTQ+ veterans experience depression and suicidal ideation at significantly higher rates than other veterans and the general population. When Ryan transitioned from active duty to civilian life, he recognized that he was experiencing symptoms of depression.
I had gone through some periods of depression, anxiety. I think it was just more situational, just life. I would just notice changes in my own, behavior, not doing things that I would typically know to do, sleeping a lot, just agitated, drinking more, using substances.
Even after being separated from the military and enduring the breakup of her marriage, Erin continued to struggle internally with finding and understanding her identity.
And there was a 10-year gap between the time I had to leave the military and the time I was finally willing to explore and understand who I was. Basically living with a low-level depression that I hadn't really been able to identify. I was having struggles within myself that I wasn't dealing with, and so that compounded as well. There came a time when I would get up in the morning about 11 o'clock because I had to be to work at noon, and I worked right across the street. I'd get dressed and I'd go to work, and I'd come home from work about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and I'd go back to bed. And one morning I woke up and said, why am I bothering to wake up? And there was a little bit of me going back to when I was a platoon leader and a company commander that if a soldier had said that to me, that would have been a flashing red light. And that part of me that was still in control took me to the VA the following day, where I was triaged and provided with a therapist.
After advocating for herself, Becca was ultimately able to stay in Afghanistan. She tried her best to move on and put everything behind her, but an incident at home brought everything back.
I knew that impacted me, but I didn't really think much about it till after I got out of the Navy, and then somebody tried to break into my house.
She knew she needed to get help, but wondered if anyone would understand. That's when she decided to visit her local VA.
Sometimes it is tough. People think because they can't physically see something wrong, then nothing is. And that's so frustrating. I was also in during Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Tim had hoped that the burden of hiding his identity would be lifted when he transitioned into civilian life. He was looking forward to a fresh start. However, he soon discovered that he was still stuck between two worlds.
I gave him a DD-214 and I drove off base. I was so happy. I was jamming out to Lady Gaga. But I was like, now I can find my identity and I can figure out who I am. I can find my partner. I can establish myself in this life. Where I was like, wait a minute, what do I do now? Because all my brothers, I still couldn't tell them. I still couldn't tell them anything. I was ashamed to tell them. I was ashamed of myself. So I immediately, and not on purposely, walled them all off. And those, like I told you, I loved them. They were my brothers. But now I had put a wall up, and so I was all by myself. I started doing more than drinking. You can resist and resist, but eventually you'll give in because you want to be a part of the in crowd of the crowd you're around. So I started abusing harder substances than alcohol. And I went back to living a double life. In the foreground, I was trying to be this outstanding member of the community, but in the background, I was just, a little kid and crying and alone and hurting. And the only way to make the hurting stop was to get out of my mind.
For each of these veterans, seeking help ultimately allowed them to embrace their identity and served an important role in their recovery.
I remember when they first asked, like, are you straight, lesbian, bi, da-da? I'm like, oh, I'm bi. And then I panicked and I thought, oh, what have I done? And I realized that it was okay. They're like, you're fine. We just need to know. It helps us build, paint a picture. And immediately it was like a huge sense of relief being able to be open and honest with my care provider. The hardest part is that very first time. You say it, and then there's a little bit of, what did I just say? And then each time it gets easier to talk about how you're feeling or to, I guess, process it. That's a big part of it too, is even figuring out like your identity or everything in general.
When Ryan sought help from VA for his challenges with depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder, he didn't know what to expect. But he knew there would be resources waiting and, more importantly, people who understood.
Being a veteran, there's a lot of things that you deal with that, a typical civilian in the community just doesn't get. So, knowing I could go to the VA and be open was huge for me. I've got my father, he's a Vietnam veteran. He's struggled with bouts of suicide, depression, anxiety as well. So doing what I'm doing now and, going through, the VA, I've been able to kind of help and guide him through some hard times as well. So I think through just talking with him about my experience with the VA, good and bad, I think it kind of helped to open his eyes about, this could be something that I could use as well.
Working with a therapist helped Erin recognize there was more to the depression she was experiencing than she realized.
And about 10 months in, I realized that it wasn't my transgender issues or my gender identity that was the problem. It was the fact that I had never grieved the loss of my career, the loss of my family, or any of the issues that went around that. Since that time, I've been involved with a support group for transgender veterans, and I've been involved with therapy and other programs through the VA, which have made a huge difference in my life when it comes to dealing with all my issues. I know that I can go to the VA and have somebody to talk to if things get rough.
As Tim felt himself losing control over his life, he reached out to VA for help.
So I went to the VA and I was like, something's wrong with me. I tell myself to stop and I can't, and then I do it anyway. And then I tell myself it won't happen again, and then it repeats. It's a perpetuating cycle that I can't get out of. The lady at the VA, mental health, she really pointed out to me about how the phases of my life had gone, how I had never established an identity for myself, who I am, my why, my reason for going, and the only thing I had ever really held on to was being a Marine, and it's gone. When you live a double life, it's hard to combine them at any point. They're parallel lines. And for treatment in itself to work, you have to meet those two lines, which is uncomfortable. But I had to find, honestly, the strength in myself to put myself through this. In the past year, I've resorted back to thinking about just being a good Marine.
Serving in the military is a solemn honor that can be challenging under the best of circumstances. Navigating these challenges with the additional burden of having to disguise something as essential as your identity can have a compounding effect. But as we heard today, being true to yourself and open with those around you can make all the difference. This is how Tim summarizes the lesson he learned throughout his treatment.
Be honest with yourself and be honest with the people who love you and who will stand by you, because you're most likely going to lose very little and you're going to gain a lot.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Real Veterans, Real Stories, brought to you by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs' Make the Connection campaign. Visit MakeTheConnection.net, an online resource designed to connect veterans, their family members, and friends, and other supporters with information, resources, and solutions to issues affecting their lives.